The following documentary is dedicated to those who lost their lives in Florida and along the northern Gulf Coast of the United States from Hurricane Katrina. The following video was shot by Chris Calora and myself, Doug Kiesling. The footage was shot in late August of 2005, during the first landfall of Hurricane Katrina in Florida and her second landfall along the Gulf Coast of Mississippi and in New Orleans. This video production is being released online at hurricanefootage.com for the 5-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. On August 23rd of 2005, Tropical Depression 12 formed in the Caribbean. It rapidly became Tropical Storm Katrina on August 24th as it drifted towards South Florida. Then on August 25th, it strengthened into Hurricane Katrina.
All right, here we are, August 25th. This is about 4 o'clock. Hurricane Katrina just been upgraded. Category 1 Hurricane Katrina. It's supposed to be coming into northern Broward County.
Chris Calora was documenting what everyone thought would be a minimal storm hitting the Fort Lauderdale area and set up to see the worst of Katrina at Deerfield Beach. Even though Katrina was a minimal hurricane with sustained winds of just 75 miles per hour, its sustained winds were still equivalent to an F1 tornado hitting the area for an extended period of time. With the winds blowing at hurricane force, it was extremely dangerous to be out in the storm, but there were a lot of people out driving around the hurricane, sightseeing and risking their lives for nothing.
It's bumping south a little bit, just in northern part of Pompano Beach. Eye wall is just coming in now. It's a miracle this place still has power. Getting very, very dark. We're entering the eye wall here. This is Pompano Beach. Time is about 6:30 p.m. Storm is definitely strengthening as it's making landfall. The eye is about half on shore right now. Time is about 6:55 Eastern Daylight Time. We've still got a very strong easterly wind here. I can't believe I'm actually at my home right now. The winds have lightened up a lot. Winds are only about 15-20 miles an hour here. Sky's brighter. No blue sky, but that is because right now we are right. We're right about there. So we're in the center of that. We got very intense convection getting ready to come back on shore. Very interesting. So we're right now in the edge of the eye, northern edge of the eye. Very light winds. Storm's only half over. Just want to show you how still the trees are. That lightning is from the eye wall approaching us from the east. Whoa, there it is. Whoa, trees coming down there. God. Uh-oh, uh-oh. And back in the eye wall again. All power's out now. People shouldn't have been out in the eye.
Gusts making Katrina Category 1 hurricane. Additional strengthening is possible before landfall.
When Katrina hit South Florida, several people died as a direct result of the hurricane when they were killed by falling trees. As Katrina moved inland across Florida during the overnight hours, its path took it on a southwest track, and by midnight, the center of the storm was now entering the Gulf of Mexico. The next day, Chris was on board the NOAA high-altitude weather research aircraft from MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa. Unlike the Air Force Hurricane Hunters, which fly through the eye of the storm at around 10,000 feet, the high-altitude research mission was to sample the environment around the storm at about 45,000 feet. The aircraft was loaded with scientific equipment for the researchers, whose mission was to drop probes from the aircraft, which are called dropsondes. The dropsondes are packed with weather instrumentation and are deployed from the aircraft at various points around the storm. As the dropsondes fall back to Earth on a parachute, they relay weather conditions at various levels in the atmosphere back to the researchers in the aircraft. On their 8-hour mission, They were to deploy 23 drop zones around the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. Their flight path would eventually take them into the spiral bands of Hurricane Katrina between the Florida Keys and Cuba. While flying at 45,000 feet, the clouds towered up to 65,000 feet as they flew past the eye of the storm. On August 27th, I flew into New Orleans from Minneapolis to get into position before the massive evacuation started.
Greg Orkson from Metairie, down by Rummel High School, sitting here at the Exxon on Williams waiting for the contraflow to start. We're heading to Baton Rouge, me and my sisters and my cousins, and go and stay with our brother and sister up there, waiting for it to move. So we're just waiting right now, hoping everything turns out okay.
Shortly after getting set up at my hotel, which is right next to the New Orleans airport in the city of Kenner, the counterflow began. The contraflow is where all lanes of traffic on Interstate 10 go outbound away from the city. As soon as the counterflow began, it started to relieve the massive traffic jam in the westbound lanes of Interstate 10 as the metropolitan area of over 1 million people started to evacuate. But at this time, this was only a voluntary evacuation. The evacuation traffic on the city streets was no better. The police, National Guard, and state police, they all had their hands full with directing the evacuation traffic as everyone hoped that Katrina would go the wrong way and spare New Orleans. This is my first time staying in New Orleans. I've always heard about the French Quarter and how the party never stops. I shot this footage during the overnight hours, and you have to remember, Katrina was now just 24 hours away from the city. While filming this footage, Katrina was upgraded to a Category 4 hurricane with winds of 145 miles per hour, and the party barely even slowed down on Bourbon Street. Some business owners started to rethink about staying in the city and started to board up their shops.
We're gonna think about it in the morning. You know, if they do a mandatory evacuation, we're gonna leave.
It was hard to believe that Katrina was just 24 hours away from the city, since Bourbon Street was packed, the bars were rocking the night away as if it was any other night. Most people thought the hurricane would miss the city as they'd done so many times in the past, so they didn't take the storm that serious, while others were rethinking their plans about staying in the city.
Well, now, yeah, we're leaving tomorrow morning. Well, my parents have been watching the Weather Channel all day long, worried to death in New York, like, you guys have the hurricane. And now all of a sudden we're like, yeah, the hurricane's coming, but we're going to be leaving.
Moving like right about here. Everything's nice and hot.
Wait 30 hours.
I'm gonna sit it out in a hotel room. I mean, figure to leave the house, take everything with me, board up in 26th floor of a hotel and ride it out.
While shooting this footage, I could never imagine at the time that this would be the absolute last images of the last night on Bourbon Street prior to Katrina flooding the city. The next morning on August 28th, the mayor of New Orleans ordered the first ever mandatory evacuation of the city. The police and National Guard, they had their hands full with trying to keep the mass exodus of the region under control and running as smooth as possible. Because unlike yesterday, where people were leaving New Orleans just in case Katrina hit, now they're in a panic to get out of the city. With just 10 hours until the storm hit, the traffic jam was biblical. All lanes heading west at what can only be described as a walking speed. The traffic jam went on for as far as the eye could see in both directions, as the reality of what was now just hours away offshore was now sinking in. A Category 5 hurricane heading for the Big Easy. The time was 6 p.m. There was only 6 hours until Katrina brought hurricane-force winds to the region. The East Jefferson Parish levee personnel were trying to finish up a last-minute levee that ran across Airline Highway. It was a temporary levee made up of hundreds of massive sandbags that connected to the permanent earthen levees on each side of the road. As the levee district personnel worked to seal off Airline Highway, the mayor of Kenner at the time was overseeing the work being done.
We're trying to close off the road so that hopefully we can stop some of the floodwaters from running into our city.
The levee board?
I'm president of East Jefferson Levee District. I've been on the board for about 14 years, and this is the worst hurricane I've ever seen. and I'm hoping we get past it well.
The mood of the levee personnel as they worked was a mix of somber urgency because they knew it was just offshore. After documenting the levee construction across Airline Highway, I headed back into downtown New Orleans. The clouds raced above the buildings, and the city was a virtual ghost town. But on Bourbon Street, a sign outside of one of the bars was a bad omen for anyone who still stayed in the city. I just could not believe that some of the bars were still open as Katrina was coming to town, and there were still people partying in the streets. For those on Bourbon Street who stayed, I can only hope they survived the hurricane, as well as the flooding afterwards, and made it out to safety. Because those on Bourbon Street, along with the rest of the Gulf Coast, they were about to meet Katrina. The following footage was shot at the Lake Pontchartrain Center in Kenner just after midnight on August 29th. The eye of Katrina was still several hours away, but the hurricane-force wind gusts were starting to pick up and hit the area. The Kenner police were out patrolling the shoreline and looking for any breaks in the levee. They were also watching for anyone they saw out on the streets due to the curfew to protect the city against looters. Anyone they saw out on the streets, including me, was subject to being arrested. Only after proving that I was with the media did they tell me I was free to film, but I was on my own if anything happened to me. The lake was starting to be pushed over the banks of Lake Pontchartrain as the winds blew from north to south. This was another sign of things to come. Around the same time, Chris made it up from Florida to Biloxi for the second landfall of Katrina.
We're the only ones in Biloxi. There is nobody except skeleton law enforcement here. It's the most loneliest, humbling feeling being in an evacuation area like this. This is Biloxi, Mississippi. Or actually maybe just slightly west of Biloxi, Mississippi. And we are at the Biloxi Arena, or Biloxi Coliseum actually, about 5 to 6 hours before the landfall of Katrina as a Cat 5. It's the Coliseum right here. Mississippi coast. Category 5 winds should be safe in here. All concrete around us. That's our little safe spot. Let's hope we don't have to use it. And the kind of scary thing is very wide open structure here. But it is the strongest structure around. It's going to get incredibly loud in here when this thing goes by. There's going to be a lot of failures on the roof up there, but again, we'll be safe in our safe spot in there, hopefully. Praying, but we should be safe.
It was just around 3 o'clock in the morning, and the worst of Katrina was starting to come on shore. The last update from the National Hurricane Center said that Katrina was still a Category 5, moving north at 15 with sustained winds of 160 miles per hour. The winds were starting to blow power lines around in the New Orleans area, and they were shorting out wiring, which caused several buildings to catch on fire in Kenner. The firefighters had to battle the tropical storm and hurricane-force wind gusts, while they tried to stop the fire from spreading to nearby buildings. My mission was to document Katrina in downtown New Orleans, so I had to keep moving as the eye of the storm raced towards the city. What worried me now was that the canals along the interstate were already filling up with water, as the worst of Katrina was still a few hours away. Once again, I could have never imagined at the time, as I drove on Interstate 10 into downtown New Orleans, that in 24 hours, this area would be under 6 to 8 feet of water and used as a boat ramp and rescue staging area. When I got into the areas around the city that still had power, the freshwater flooding from the rain was already evident in the low-lying areas. I continued into downtown while avoiding the hazardous debris that was starting to cover the road. Once I got into the heart of the city, what I had expected to happen was happening. The tall buildings were acting as sails and accelerating the winds at the ground level. Even if the eye of Katrina missed New Orleans, the tall buildings would still amplify the winds at the ground level in downtown. The following footage shows the raw power of Katrina as the western eye wall approached the city. Luckily for me, the power was still on in downtown New Orleans. I could still see the power of the wind as well as dodge the flying debris. Just across from Bourbon Street, on the other side of Canal Street, on Cron de Lay, the winds were even more intense due to the tall buildings deflecting the winds. But even as the debris was starting to fly, throughout the entire storm, the New Orleans police were out patrolling the downtown streets. Now as I got back into my truck to change locations while driving on Canal Street, more debris was starting to fall and cover the ground, as well as small trees were starting to get knocked down. This billboard on Canal Street was now a sign of what was to come. Debris from the billboard littered Canal Street as well as the power lines and the tracks for the trolley. As the winds picked up, the fallen debris is now able to blow around as very large shrapnel. Now after checking out the area around Canal Street and finding it to be a great place to shoot and take shelter if I needed to, I decided to head on over towards the Superdome. The roads were starting to become covered with water around the Superdome. In the street that ran underneath the Macy's department store next to the Superdome, it was already covered by over a foot of water. This was not a good sign, and it really gave me an uneasy feeling just being in this part of town. So I decided to head on back to Canal Street through the flooding and the debris-covered roads. On my way back to Canal Street, the green light for the fate of the city was given. Bummer. The power failed at 6:21 in the morning. As soon as the power failed, everything seemed to go from bad to total disaster really fast, with large trees now blocking the roadways and flying debris everywhere. To make matters worse, the gravel on top of the buildings that was used as part of the roofing was now being blown around like large hailstones. The time was about 6:30 in the morning. As the sun was rising over New Orleans, the city as the world knew it was being laid to waste before me. Just trying to make it back to Canal Street with all the trees being knocked down was almost impossible. And to top it off, the larger debris was now being picked up and blown around by the wind. At the height of the winds, the New Orleans police were the only other people I saw out on the streets. Everyone else was either evacuated or taking shelter. Now I was all alone as the squad car took off, as the debris was starting to fly past my truck. The western side of Katrina's eye was starting to hit the downtown area, but this was not the worst of the storm. The worst of Katrina hit Mississippi. 90 miles to my northeast in Biloxi, Chris was now seeing the first effects of Hurricane Katrina. At the end of the parking lot, just past the stoplights, is the Gulf of Mexico. While Chris was on the eastern side of the eye of Katrina, I was still on the western eye wall, and the winds were picking up all kinds of deadly debris. The time now was about 6:45 in the morning. Chris was pinned down in Biloxi at the Coliseum, while I was dodging debris on Canal Street across from Harris Casino. The following footage shows the raw power of Hurricane Katrina, and the flooding hasn't even begun yet. While writing the voiceover script for this project, at first I left this section with only the natural sound and you could hear what was happening around us. I thought seeing the hurricane's power like a fly in the wall would be enough, but it wasn't. I spent days trying to think of something smart and witty to say, and I drew a blank. Then I realized, watching this footage is like watching the footage from the September 11th terrorist attacks. At this time, over 1,800 people are about to die along the Gulf Coast. While this might offend some to compare the two events, 238 people died in Mississippi, and 1,577 people lost their lives in Louisiana because of Katrina. When you think about the number of people who lost everything, including their lives, describing the power of the wind seems kind of pointless. It was 7:10 in the morning as I changed locations in the middle of the hurricane to avoid the flying debris. I found a place to park at the Marriott on Canal Street, where several police and EMS personnel were riding out the storm as well. They were just hanging out in front of the hotel and watching helplessly as the destruction ensued around them. The next thing I saw was just amazing. This man was literally hanging on for his life on Canal Street in the middle of the hurricane. The actual wind speeds at this time are unknown, because of all the buildings acting as sails, pushing and shifting the winds in different directions. Where one area would be calm on the downwind side of the building, just across the street and a few stories up, the winds were catastrophic. The police officer knew what I was doing, but he had some questions for the man hanging on for his life as soon as he was able to make it over to us. As the winds battered downtown New Orleans, Chris went out into the storm with his underwater video camera in Biloxi. He went out to the end of the parking lot at the Coliseum and found that it was now the Gulf of Mexico and filled with debris. The water kept rising, and anything in its path was doomed as wave after wave moved on shore. But this wasn't storm surge, this was debris-filled storm surge. Looking up from Canal Street, I cannot even begin to describe the power of the winds at this time, as it's ripping off the roof of this building. As I watched the buildings in downtown New Orleans get laid to waste by the winds, Chris was watching what was coming my way as the water kept getting deeper and deeper. The latest reports about Katrina said that it weakened to a strong Category 3 as soon as it made landfall in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. Even if Katrina had weakened, it was still hitting a major metropolitan city, and I had to wonder about the storm surge. Wave after wave kept coming ashore in Biloxi. Chris was not even seeing the strongest winds yet. And I could not even believe that one of New Orleans police officers was still out patrolling even in the height of the storm. The wind had now blown out the top of the building and blew in the windows across the street. And in Biloxi, it was no better. Chris went back to the Coliseum after seeing that the Gulf of Mexico would soon be in the parking lot and maybe up to the building, which is 20 feet above sea level. In the next half hour, everything around Chris would be underwater and become the Gulf of Mexico. The time now was 7:55 in the morning as I once again tried to change locations in the middle of the hurricane. I drove through the French Quarter, and it really didn't look that bad. There was some ponding of water on the streets, but it looked as if New Orleans was spared from the total destruction that everyone forecasted. Unfortunately, this was the high ground of New Orleans. It was the same area that the media stayed in and reported all was fine after the storm as the city began to flood. Even though the city was hit by hurricane-force winds and a lot of the buildings were damaged and trees were being knocked down, it was really not as bad as I expected, since the storm weakened right before making landfall. But in Mississippi, on the right front quadrant of the storm, it was a lot worse than in New Orleans. Even so, in Biloxi, the police were still out patrolling the city. I started to see people out walking around in the storm. Even though the winds were still blowing at hurricane force, I wondered why were they out walking around in the middle of a hurricane. But I thought, hey, this is New Orleans. Anything's possible. As I started to work my way back towards Canal Street, I started to find more buildings that were damaged by the storm. But what I was seeing was nothing compared to what was happening on the other side of the eye. I was on the weaker western side of the eye, and I could only imagine what Chris was seeing over in Mississippi.
High wall.
Wow. This is the eye wall. We're in the eye wall.
While Chris was starting to get slammed by the eastern eye wall of Katrina, the wind soon picked up again in New Orleans as the west side of the eye wall was just a few miles away from downtown. On Canal Street, the wind was picking up large objects and throwing them around like toys. What everyone feared the most was now happening. In Mississippi, the storm surge was now coming up to the Coliseum.
There's a surge. Oh my God. That's the storm surge coming in. Look at the storm surge coming in.
Even though Katrina had weakened considerably to a Category 3 hurricane, it was too little, too late. The surge was already put into motion like a tsunami as the winds were ripping apart the region. Where I was at on Canal Street, it was not very safe, and I needed to keep moving to find shelter from the winds as well as higher ground, since it looked like the rainwater was now starting to flood the streets. As soon as I started down Canal Street, someone flagged me down for help. What he told me would change everything, and now I knew why people were out walking around in the hurricane.
What's up? How you doing, man? I had to leave out of my house, man. I don't know whether that water's coming over that levee or what.
The last I heard, it's not.
Huh?
The storm missed us.
I can't hear you.
The storm went east.
Think I can get in, man, and get somewhere?
I got no room.
Is that hotel down there?
Yeah, they got plenty of places down there people are just chilling out at.
All right.
I give you a ride.
So you haven't heard about that water coming over that levee from the lake?
No. Check it out.
Because the water started rising so high in my two-story apartment, I had to get out, man.
Where's that at?
Right across the North Robinson overpass.
Okay.
Around Clewood on Louisa Street.
How far down? I'm from Minneapolis, covering the story.
All right.
How far down is that on this road?
That's a good piece down, man.
Okay, I'm going to go down and check it out, though.
The storm surge from Katrina was now hitting all along the coast. The parking lot of the Coliseum was now the Gulf of Mexico. The time was just after 8:30 in the morning as I drove north to investigate the report about the levees being breached. I also called the news desk that I was working with to find out if they have heard anything about the levees failing. What I did find out was that they evacuated their crew yesterday just in case the levees failed.
Hey, I'm still getting slammed here. But any word on the levee? No, I'm asking, do you know anything about the levee? Is it gone? Is it good? Is it... Yeah. Alright, yeah, 'cause some dude just came up to me and said, like, water's up to his apartment in the second story. And so I'm gonna go check it out.
If the levee had in fact failed, and water was rushing into New Orleans as it was in Biloxi, I would have to find a way out of the city and fast. As I headed north towards the I-10 overpass, the standing water did not seem that bad, but the debris in the road, that was another story. As I reached the area of the I-10 overpass at North Robinson and St. Bernard Avenue, water was in fact rising fast. After seeing what was to come, as the floodwaters were getting deeper by the minute, I decided to abandon the hurricane intercept and head west out of the city and escape from New Orleans. I was below sea level in a major hurricane with failed levees, and Chris, he was 20 feet above sea level at the entrance of the Coliseum. The water was not covering the roads as I left to go investigate the flooding, but it was now. The water started to come up through the storm drains all around the city. Everywhere I looked, the water was rising, and it was getting deeper by the minute. Even though I was driving through the flooding, which is extremely dangerous, I was lucky since I was still mobile and I could make a run for it. But all Chris could do was try and get up higher in the Coliseum as the storm surge continued to rise. With the report of the levee failure and the water rising fast, I was now in a worst-case scenario, which is why I stayed in New Orleans. Now I want to get out of New Orleans. It was apparent that the city was going to flood, and I didn't want to become part of the story. With the Gulf of Mexico now overtaking the parking lot of the Coliseum and coming up to the steps of the entrance, it's time for Chris to take shelter inside. I made it back to Canal Street, and debris and floodwaters were now covering the roads I needed to get out of downtown. And I only had one chance to escape from New Orleans before it was submerged. An escape would mean driving through the city in hurricane-force winds with only my GPS to guide me through unfamiliar and now flooded streets. I turned on the AM radio to try and hear if any reports about the flooding and the levees failing.
We have trees that have actually been just ripped out of the ground and uprooted. We have others that have been scarred by debris flying and hitting the trees. Others where the limbs are breaking off, and there's about a 30-foot tall tree that has fallen down across two of the lanes of Ames Boulevard. And, you know, I have a very narrow window here on the world. Ooh, there goes an orange construction cone flying by. A very narrow window here on the world, but we've got to just assume that what I can see here is going to be typical of what we're going to see across the metropolitan area with these kinds of damages.
Dave, for the listeners that don't know, can you give me a better idea where you are with Belcaire and Ames Boulevard?
Canal Street was now underwater, and it was getting deeper by the minute. To avoid the flooding and the submerged debris blocking the road in front of me, I drove out of downtown on the Center Railroad tracks.
Expressway. I am at the Jefferson Parish Emergency Management Center. It's
The water was even worse on the west side of downtown. The roads now turned into rivers at the intersection of Tulane and Broad Street. In Biloxi, the storm surge was now coming into the Coliseum.
Okay, this is the wall and the glass. That's Katrina raging outside there, and that's the storm surge coming up halfway up the windows. The water just keeps going up more and more. We're going to lose these windows soon, so I don't want to be really near here when that happens. Water's busting through everything, just flowing in, just keeps issuing into the building here.
gotta go up. The only way we could do is just gotta go up.
We're not even here yet, okay? We're gonna have about 10 hours of this stuff. It's probably gonna get worse than what we have right now. You see the water coming in. We should be fine with the water. Don't panic. Keep these children down, okay? Don't run around this class anywhere. We have another spot. Go up this door here, and it'll take everybody. But you'll have to leave only your essentials. Your food and your water we take up. Okay? Just the essentials if we got to go up. If something happens, the Coliseum roof blows off, stay up underneath the overhang. Be underneath the overhang and then slide back in here. That wind will whip hard if it gets in. So what we'll do is we'll go upstairs and don't panic. There's plenty of room, okay?
Wow.
The time was now 9:16 in the morning, and the weather conditions around the whole region were now catastrophic due to the flooding. While trying to make my escape, the only way I could tell where the canal stopped and where the road started was by the thin strip of grass I could barely see along the side of the road and using my GPS. The western edge of the eye wall had passed just to the east of downtown New Orleans and was now heading inland, but the flooding has just begun. Even though the eye of the storm was now pulling away from the city and moving inland, the flying debris was also a major hazard for me as I was trying to make my escape. As I finally get to the Interstate 10 entrance ramp at South Carrollton Avenue, I took one last look around and saw that everything was now going underwater fast. Now on the entrance ramp at South Carrollton, there was even some flooding and debris, but I thought I was home free now that I was getting on Interstate 10 and can get out of the city before it flooded. But while I was getting on the entrance ramp, there's one thing that I noticed. It was the power lines that were hanging down low over the entrance ramp itself. I figured it would probably be hard for anyone with a high-profile emergency vehicle to get through this area.
Watching the situation, and the rain is pretty heavy. We have not heard of any floodwaters in the region of the dome right now, but...
And speaking of floodwaters, my hopes for a fast escape on Interstate 10 was now put on hold, as over 6 feet of water was now blocking the road in front of me.
Yeah, well, we lost the feed.
The railroad underpass on Interstate 10 was now a lake. Now I had to go back down the road I just drove on, and had to go back to following the GPS through unfamiliar and now flooded streets.
Put where you're at. As soon as this thing clears and we can get those folks home, we'll certainly do that. We certainly know it's frustrating. It's frustrating. You're worried about your property back at home, whatever home is. Certainly you are. No question about that. Grief, your heart hurts, your head hurts. You feel awful because you don't know what's happening to your property. But you know what? It's not happening to you.
In Biloxi, the storm surge was starting to submerge cars outside the Coliseum. Katrina pushed a wall of water that was over 25 feet high into Biloxi, Mississippi. The Coliseum entrance is at 20 feet above sea level, and the storm surge was now crashing through the entrance like water through a sinking ship. I was following the GPS into Metairie, and it showed I could take Metairie Road to get to the other side of the railroad tracks and up to the next Interstate 10 entrance ramp at Bonneville Boulevard. But I would have to drive through a debris-filled city to get there first. As I navigated through Metairie, the downed trees made the escape almost as bad as the floodwaters. Roads were being blocked by trees, tree limbs, street signs, downed power and phone lines, and just about anything else you could think of. The only way I can describe this footage is the escape from New Orleans. To understand why the aid was so slow to get into the city after the storm, just look at what I'm driving through and driving over. Then add in the fact that some areas were covered by up to 6 to 8 feet of water shortly after I escaped. But even as I moved further away from the lake, the floodwaters were still rising rapidly and covering the roads. I made it to the railroad tracks, but the battle was only half over. I still had to drive to the north and into the rising water to get up to the next interstate entrance at Bonneville. Driving through the flooded streets meant that I had to watch out for the flying debris as well as the submerged debris that could take out my SUV. And sometimes, the only means of escape was to drive up on someone's lawn. I didn't think it would matter that much, as this area would soon be under several feet of water. Now that I was driving back to the north, the water covering the roads was getting worse. This was simply a race against time on unfamiliar streets to get out of the city. As I make it to the Bonneville entrance ramp on Interstate 10, the water covering the road looked bad. But it got a lot worse as I crested over the slope and found that the entrance was blocked by almost 4 feet of water and debris. If you look closely, you can see the wake in front of the truck that was created by driving through the floodwaters. I saw the car that was half submerged down the road from me, and I had to stop and think if I wanted to try and go for it or not. I gave it another try, but I found there was just something very large in the water blocking the path, and the water was just too deep to go any further. It was less than 100 feet from dry ground, and I was so close, but yet so far from freedom. I had to turn around and go back the road I came. Again. The GPS said there was another entrance not far from where I was at the Causeway interchange. But I had to go north, which meant I had to go back through the floodwaters I just drove through to get to it. It seemed that the floodwaters I just drove through got even deeper in just a couple minutes' time. Now just getting there was going to be very dangerous, as I noticed that the truck was once again creating a wake in front of it as the water was rising rapidly. But at least my mobile internet was still working just fine, and people could send me instant messages to see if I was still alive. At this time, I knew I only had one chance to make it out alive, and stop signs and traffic laws, they were pretty much optional. With the escape route blocked by yet another tree, this was starting to get old fast. As I kept going towards the end of the street, the water was now coming up over the hood of the truck. I knew there was now all or nothing, but the GPS showed me there was just a little bit further to go to safety and freedom. The following is a phone call I had with the news desk I was working with. I needed to check in with them to tell them I was still alive and what I was seeing.
Right now, I am trying to evacuate to the west. Well, if it hasn't, I'm not going to go shoot it because per BNBN, a large part of New Orleans is under several feet of water. So I am basically trying to evac. And I'm trying to get back to the hotel. If I can, head west. And I don't even know if I'm going to be able to. Because, okay, that road is the river. I-12 is closed. I-10 it goes underwater too, and yeah, in places. So yeah, I'm just trying to evac out here. I'm on Veterans right now, and there's a couple. There's like 18 inches of water, but mainly right now I've seen it, where it's like, it's anywhere from 6 to 12. Basically, I'm following the curves. If I see a curb, I'm going to follow that, go over closer to it, because I know it's only like 6 to 10. But yeah, this is really bad. Really bad. Downtown's main buildings, they're pretty good. But, I gotta go, okay? I just gotta focus on driving here, okay? But yeah, this whole place is going underwater. Later, bye.
After talking with the news desk to give them an update on my location and what I was seeing, I had a little bit further to go until I was on the Causeway Bridge and then the high ground of Interstate 10. The water was getting deeper on Veterans, so I started driving with 2 wheels up on the curb to stay out of the deep water. There was just one more area of deep water, but it didn't seem that bad now, and I didn't see any trees blocking the road. As I got to the entrance ramp of the causeway, the water was deep, so I got up on the curb again to try and make it onto the causeway. Then if all goes as planned, I was home free on I-10. Now that I was on the causeway, it was just a little bit further until the Interstate 10 entrance ramp. I had to deal with some flooding, but it didn't look too bad. I thought I was going to be smooth sailing from here on out. That was, until the tree jumped out in front of me. Now that I was on Interstate 10, the drive from Causeway to Williams and to the hotel and the airport, the drive wasn't that bad for being in a hurricane. But back in Biloxi, Chris was still waiting out the flooding and storm surge. Cars were now floating outside of the Coliseum, and the storm surge was destroying everything around him. When I got back to the airport and the hotel, I found that the hotel was surrounded by water. The hotel is a 6-story building on the left side of the screen. The airport did not look like it was in that great a shape either. With water on the end of the runway, it looked like nobody was flying in or out of here anytime soon. At least I was on the high ground now, west of New Orleans, but the interstate was still blocked by debris as the city was flooding. The time now was 10:15 in the morning. I was just down the street from the hotel at the intersection of Williams and Veterans. I still needed to get back to the hotel and collect some of my stuff before I evacuated. The trick now was just going the last half mile through the fallen debris and flooded out roads. If they were still open, at least I'd have a place to get cleaned up, edit some video, and get some sleep. Getting to the hotel was going to prove to be the last hurdle, but nothing I couldn't drive around or walk through. But the storm was far from over. As I made it back to the hotel on the high ground in Kenner, the storm surge that breached the levees was still wreaking havoc on the Mississippi coastline, and to the northeast of me, Biloxi was now getting some of the strongest winds of Katrina as the eye moved on shore around 10:30 in the morning. By 11 in the morning, the strongest part of the storm passed over Biloxi. The eye of the storm had made landfall and was already north of Interstate 10. The 25 to 28 foot storm surge was now starting to level off.
Right on the edge of the eye. We're almost on the edge of the eye here. Right on the very edge of it. Strongest winds off.
By 11:30 in the morning, the storm surge is already starting to head back out into the Gulf of Mexico. As Chris surveyed the damage around the Coliseum, it was apparent that the Mississippi coast was totally devastated.
Well, the surge has finally gone down. Before it was, well, you can see the watermark. Still got at least 100 knots of wind here, gusting higher. We're still under the backside of the eye wall. We didn't quite get the eye. We got kind of clipped by it before.
Around noon, the storm surge in Biloxi had moved back into the Gulf of Mexico. Unfortunately, this was not the case in New Orleans. In the next hour, the storm surge had moved back offshore. The only thing left for Chris to worry about was clearing the debris away from the ramps so he can get his car out to go back home.
God, there's a tree trunk shoved into the Coliseum here. It's unbelievable. I can't believe what just happened in the past 5 hours. I'm afraid to see what the rest of the coast looks like. Currently 1:45, and I'm looking towards Highway 90, and the surge is completely gone. This water rushed out in no time at all. Just absolutely incredible drawdown.
I managed to make it out of the New Orleans parish as the water was rising from the failed levee system, and made it back to my hotel at the airport in Kenner. The floodwater stopped about a foot below the entrance of the hotel, and they were still open and running on a backup generator. After a short break, I was back out shooting aftermath footage around the airport. The airport did sustain a lot of wind damage, but the overall structure was pretty much intact and flood-free. It looked as if it would need days to repair the damage to the equipment, but could be taking rescue flights in a matter of hours. Inside the airport, the stranded passengers who could not get on the last flights out of the city, they spent the night in the terminal as Katrina passed over the top of them. A few windows were busted out, and some of the sections of roofing was damaged, but the jetways looked as if they were lowered instead of damaged from the storm. So with busted out car windows being the overall largest problem in the parking area, the airport looked to be a decent shelter for those who needed to rest after Katrina.
I'm very impressed by the calm from the Americans and the management of these things. Everybody was great. Firefighters, EMT, sheriff office, everything was well done. Really, I'm impressed because, you know, I'm a medical fire chief officer in France and I know the difficulties of these problems. And I know the responsibilities of these things, and I'm very impressed from the management, from the authorities of this disaster.
In the cargo area outside the airport, the damage is what I expected, with trailers tipped over and some of the hangars damaged. If the levees would have held in the city of New Orleans, it would have looked as it did around parts of Kenner near the airport just hours after the storm. Minor to moderate damage to buildings and structures, but the infrastructure was still intact. But just a few blocks from the high ground around the airport, the flooding was everywhere and contaminating everything. Unless you had a large 4x4, you were not driving anywhere. The new identity of New Orleans was now coming to life. Everyone knew the city as the Big Easy. Now, it was now being known for the biggest natural disaster in American history. The day after Katrina was a typical hot and sunny day in New Orleans in August, except for all the water. As I made my way from the airport back to the New Orleans parish border, the levee held for those who lived on the west side. But for those whose lives depended on the pumping stations and the levees in the New Orleans parish itself, it was a total disaster. As news of the disaster was now getting out, emergency personnel from all over the country were now rushing into the area to help rescue survivors.
Dave Lindsay, come from Louisville, Kentucky. Jefferson County Swift Water Team, come down there to help out. Just getting it organized and getting the good flow of people going. Coming in from the water to the rehab and to wherever they need to go, the hospital, shelter, and such.
And how many people do you think are stuck on the other side over here?
I couldn't tell you. I've only been here about a little under an hour, so my information is probably as good as yours.
How long did it take you to get down here?
We left at 5 o'clock yesterday, and we got down here right about 11, so what is that, about right at 17 hours?
And contrary to popular belief to what was all over the media, FEMA was on the scene. Here was Texas Task Force 1 trying to organize rescue efforts and set up communications to what was now one of the biggest natural disasters in American history. FEMA was there, but who was in charge of it all? That will be left up for the history books to decide. But with so many in need of help and a whole city to search, rescuing people from New Orleans was not going to happen overnight.
My name is Curtis Smith. I live in New Orleans, Louisiana. I've lived here all my life and I've never witnessed such a disaster. I just couldn't even believe when I looked out the window that something like this was happening. I want to know what were they doing with all the money that they claimed they had for the pumps for. What were the pumps for? They've been saying a big one for years, as long as I can remember. It finally happened, and we're in such disarray. What is going on? Where did the money go at? That's all I would like to know.
Where do you have friends and family that live outstate?
Yeah, I have friends and family, but the majority of my family is in New Orleans. I wasn't going to desert them. We went to...
I'm just saying so we can get like a message out to somebody.
California, you got...
Yeah, in California, in San Francisco, tell them we all right.
Okay.
The Smith family is all right.
You have their phone number handy or something? So I'm heading to Houston. I might be able to give them a call.
I don't know the number.
Oh, that's written down in the book.
Okay.
How many Smith families were there to come? As the day wore on, the number of people being rescued grew. The one thing I really noticed was the number of people being rescued with their pets. Since many shelters and hotels do not accept animals, a lot of people stayed home with their pets to ride out the storm.
Well, my name's Ken Parmentel. I stayed here because I had the dogs, and I wasn't sure whether to actually go or not, and a lot of places don't have them, and I hadn't gotten to the bank, so I didn't have enough money, so I figured for the best. And then when you get on the road, you got that bumper-to-bumper stuff, so, you know, now we got another situation. What's going to happen now? But other than that, I'm glad. I appreciate getting picked up off my roof. And the dogs.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
You were on the roof?
I was on the roof. Yeah, I had to swim out to smoke. I had to swim out underneath to get out, to get on the roof. Because I didn't have any tools or anything, so I had to. It was pretty hard with all the debris. I swam down under the, and then I got back up on the roof.
Okay.
And these guys cut me out.
I'm Bill Delaney, and I just want to say hey to my mom and my cousin Amy up in Baton Rouge, and I'm okay and headed your way.
The only thing I could really do now to help out was to try and get a message out for people. I started to collect some phone numbers and contacts for those that I met. I wanted to try and get a message out to their friends and family so that they would at least know they are still alive and safe. The Interstate 10-610 interchange was now a boat ramp for those who needed to be rescued, as the pumps that were supposed to save the city sat silent. Many local boat owners rushed to help out with the rescue efforts, as word of the size of the disaster got out. I kept having to remind myself this was just a job I do, and that tomorrow I'd be 1,000 miles away in a different world as I watched the residents who just lost everything in New Orleans being brought to dry land. The images I was getting of the boats floating down the interstate and people being rescued, it was just surreal. All I could think about was what Mr. Smith said. They said the big one was coming for years, and I kept asking myself, why didn't some of these people evacuate when they had the chance? A lot of people don't know that at least 20% of the population of New Orleans before Katrina was so poor they didn't even have the means to escape on their own except for public transportation. I could barely begin to describe the visual images of this disaster as I look over all the flooding with downtown New Orleans in the distance. The roof of this red car under several feet of water on the road below me shows the severity and the scope of what I escaped from that was now all across the city. To help put it into perspective, about 1,000 feet beyond the bridge and around the bend in the road is the railroad underpass where I had to turn around yesterday. As more rescue personnel showed up, so did the first air-conditioned buses to bring the people to the next staging area. With all the tragedy around me, I was still able to find one person who, after losing everything, was still in a good mood because she was still alive.
Erica Manger, M-E-N-G-E-R. Okay. Yes, I live here in New Orleans in Lakeview off of Rosemary by Florida Boulevard and Canal Boulevard. And basically we had to, hi Ryan, he's my little brother, we're okay, we're going to the Superdome. But anyway, basically we had to get out and go to the next door neighbor's house onto their second floor. Unfortunately, we felt bad about that, but anyway, so we had to do that, and then our cats are still at the house, 4 cats, so we had to put them on the top floor and give them a lot of food and water and litter, and probably poop everywhere. But anyway, we had 9 feet of water. Basically everything's done. Piano, grandfather clock, you name it, all of our nice stuff. My mom's china, all that good stuff. But it's okay, you know. It makes you a stronger person. We don't know why God does these types of things.
I talked to Erica a few months after Katrina. She told me that her family did not go to the Superdome, they were bused to a shelter in Baton Rouge.
Sitting there, rode the storm out, sitting at home with a generator, and said, I got to come help somebody.
So you brought your boat down for them?
But we had the boat with us.
Okay.
Now, the number of boats that were arriving on the scene were becoming overwhelming for those who were trying to organize the rescue efforts.
It's a screw-up, basically, what it is. We have a space problem down there. Once we get 2 boats down there to turn around and back in, then we can't get 2 more, and then we end up with a big snafu down there. So as soon as they clear the area, we'll get a couple down there and launch them. We'll do a big old circle and get all these guys in the water.
As I started to head back to the hotel and grab my gear, and then evacuate myself out of the area to Houston, I stopped at the staging area at Causeway and Interstate 10. The number of rescue personnel on standby was overwhelming, as the National Guard and Coast Guard were dropping off survivors that they rescued by helicopter from rooftops. Despite what was portrayed by some in the media, rescue personnel were there to help. But with the flooding, the only way to get people into the city to help out was by helicopter or boat. It was pretty heartbreaking to see that many did not want to leave without their pets. Now that's all they had left. As the school buses were now arriving to take people away to shelters in Baton Rouge and other cities in the region, it was starting to give people hope in a hopeless situation. With at least 60,000 people that needed to be rescued from the flooding in New Orleans, this was just now overwhelming. It was going to take at least a week or longer to help everyone. Some were lucky enough to make it out with a few personal belongings, while others did not even make it out with their shirt on their backs. But they all had one thing in common: they were all alive. As I was getting ready to leave the Causeway and I-10 area, a man with his dog came up and asked me for help. He asked me to give him a ride to his parents' house in the city of Kenner, and it was right next to the airport. As we arrived at his parents' house, it was undamaged and he had a place to stay. Here's his story. It pretty much says it all.
Okay, this morning, I guess about 11 o'clock, once the major part of the hurricane was over, water started rising, I would say approximately a foot an hour, and by 4 o'clock in the evening, we had 6 to 8 foot water reaching the second level of the floor. By the following morning, Coast Guard came and started rescuing us, and we was returned to a Coast Guard drop-off spot. And we remained there and took aid there, and that's about it. I don't know what else to say.
That works. Why'd you stay?
Trying to ride out the storm. I didn't think it would be that bad. I really didn't. And they had a breach in the levee system, and that's why once the hurricane came through and was over with, water started rising because the levee had breached, and we just started taking catastrophic amounts of water in, and there was nothing you can do.
The record-breaking hurricane season of 2005 was now history, but the controversy surrounding the storms and what happened afterwards was far from over. 9 months after Katrina, downtown New Orleans looked fine on the surface. In the French Quarter, it was open for tourists looking to have a good time. It looked good in downtown New Orleans, with people walking the streets going about their everyday lives. The last time I was here on Canal Street was when Katrina was ripping apart the city. Now it looks as if it was open for business as usual. 9 months ago, the city was flooding. But now, not much has changed except for the flooding. This image of the flooded street with the school bus was seen around the world, and 9 months later, it was still there. And all the flooded cars were still there, just piled up around town like a junkyard. All around, everywhere you looked, there were thousands of flooded cars just waiting to be removed 9 months after Katrina. And the smell? Except for the French Quarter, the smell around the city was a cross between a garbage dump and a junkyard. With all the mold, oil, and fluids mixed into the dirt, it was pretty nasty. You could easily tell how deep the cars were by the water lines and which cars were totally submerged. For anyone needing auto body parts, this looked like the world's largest free collision auto parts source. There were even still stray dogs running around the streets. Due to time constraints, I'm unable to show everything in detail around New Orleans, but the following is a brief tour of the Upper Ninth Ward 9 months after Katrina. This is the Upper Ninth Ward, not the Lower Ninth Ward. You can see how high the water was by the stain on some of the homes. There were a few FEMA trailers, but for the most part, the area was a ghost town. Across the river in the Lower Ninth Ward, it was totally destroyed. To add insult to injury, not much was done to clean up the area since the storm hit. Now the ruins of the Lower Ninth Ward neighborhoods were now a tourist attraction for the few out-of-town tourists that did come back into the city. As I drove around the Lower Ninth, block after block was just laid to waste. There were very few homes even left standing for people to come back to, and the ones that were left standing, would anyone want to move back into an area that was now a toxic waste dump with all the polluted soil from the flooding? Everywhere you looked in the Lower Ninth Ward to Araby, it was total devastation. Houses on top of cars, houses destroyed. Houses moved hundreds of feet as they floated away in the flood. Cars upside down in the middle of fields. Cars on top of cars. Cars on top of houses. Houses in the middle of roads. It was total and utter devastation. Some of the things I saw were just inconceivable, and it went on for miles and miles. Everything screamed danger as I continued to drive around in the devastation. What was crazy was the number of houses that were in the middle of roads. What looked like a driveway was actually a street where the house came to rest after the flooding. As I drove past a failed industrial canal, the Army Corps engineer was now rebuilding it. The repair work was progressing, even as the area outside of the construction zone was a post-Katrina apocalyptic wasteland.